For this project, we're gonna be using a little bit larger slab, if you would like to. You can make this object that we're gonna be making, a slab bowl. And for this project, you can use a larger piece of clay or you can use smaller pieces of clay. The problem is that if you're trying to make a bowl, you may have to make several small pieces to connect them together to make anything large enough that could be considered a bowl. So what you want to do is maybe just start out with a little bit more clay than you've been using. And I'm going to be showing you guys how to pound out and put together a larger slab. And then from there, we're going to be making some cutouts and then putting some pieces together and then adding a foot. So I've got a larger chunk of clay that I cut off of my big chunk of clay, and then I've taken it and just pounded it into a ball. So in order for me to start to get a handle on this thing, there's a number of different things I can do. The easiest of which is going to be just to start pounding this object down and starting to make it into a flatter object. Being very careful not to pound too hard. The other thing that you can do is if you want to, you can actually lift this ball up and hold it from a larger distance and then drop it down onto your surface. You can also do this on to the ground if you have a garage or if you have a patio that has a little bit, you know, a nice flat piece of concrete. That is something that you can use to actually pound this piece of clay out as well. For those of you guys who I've given a demonstration to before about throwing out a slab on the ground, you can do that as well. That's gonna yield a nice large slab. I'm gonna be doing just on the tabletop here by hitting it with my fist. And I'm gonna be using this part of my fist. You wanna use this part of your fist, not your knuckles. If you end up using your knuckles, those knuckles are gonna end up putting a bunch of indentations into your slab. So I'm gonna go ahead and do a time lapse here so you don't have to watch it happen in real time. In the time lapse, I'm not sure if you noticed, but I started out in the center of the object and then spiraled out towards the outside edges as I was pounding with the bottom of my fist. And then a little bit later on in the time lapse, I started to work from the center directly towards the outside edge rather than spiraling, going out like the spoke of a wheel, if you will, from the center to the outside edge. And that started to actually allow that slab of clay to start expanding a little bit further. And then finally at the very end, I don't know if you noticed, but I used the flat portion of my palm. I kind of hyperextended my fingers and I was actually hitting down onto the surface. Main reason that I was doing that is to try and get more of the lumps and bumps to go away. So now I've got myself a pretty decent slab that I can use to cut off some pieces. And one thing that I'm probably gonna do, because there are still a few lumps and bumps, is I'll probably throw this out a little bit on the table or onto my surface just to kind of flatten things out, trying to get rid of as many of those lumps and bumps. It's a little bit on the thick side at this moment in time, but we're trying to shoot for about 1/4 of an inch or a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch, no larger than 3/8 of an inch. That'd be a little bit too thick for something like a small bowl that we'll be making. So I'm able to peel it up off the surface pretty easily, and then I can take this and kind of give it a little bit of a toss down to the surface, just real light, because I'm not trying to change this a ton. I'm just trying to get it a little bit flatter, a few less lumps and bumps, a little bit thinner. Notice that I'm turning it over each time. I'm turning it about a quarter of a turn each time as well. And in doing so, it's kind of maintaining that roundness, which is not necessary. If you want a longer slab, you could just continue to throw it in one direction rather than spinning it a quarter of a turn. But this is getting it a little bit thinner, which is what I'm shooting for. Touching it with a lot of surface area of my fingers, so making sure that I've got a lot of fingers on this as I'm doing this. And now it looks like it's getting pretty flat. A lot of those marks are gone. And the last thing I can do is maybe leave it up on this side where I do have some of those marks. And then I can go ahead with a flat rib and start to go over these little sections. Or I could even come in here with my finger like so. There's a couple little marks here on the edges. I wouldn't be too concerned about the edges because the edges we're probably not going to end up using. We'll end up cutting those little bits off, all right? So as long as everything looks good inside of here, in the middle section, that's what we're kind of shooting for. I'm going to be using a paper template for this, and so what I've done is just taken an 8.5 by 11 page and kind of drawn on here exactly what it is that I kind of wanted to go for. So I've got these 4 walls here that are about equal distant, plus I've got this shape in the center. I wanted to go for more of a square shaped bowl. This is something that can be done round, any kind of shape that you want to go for. You could probably even look up online for some paper templates to give you some ideas. The other things that you can do is just kind of figure it out in your head. That's essentially what I've done here. So I'm going to be cutting this up, and that way I can have individual pieces. So I'll have 5 pieces for this template. I'm going to end up making a foot for the bottom of this object as well, but I won't be doing that until a little bit later. So now that I've got my paper templates all set to go, I have them sitting on my clay. One of the things that I can do, I've got a excess of clay here. So if I'm gonna be making anything more slab, or if I'm gonna be using other slabs for any portion of this, I wanna kind of center it maybe a little bit differently than I have here. Because that way we can get as much kind of space out of everything. So what I'm gonna start by doing is I'm gonna remove some of these sides. And notice that I put some numbers on there. Those are that way they kind of fit essentially, if it's not exactly the same. I ended up kind of just drawing this out freehand just to make it a little bit kind of easier on myself. And then I went ahead and marked on there essentially with that 1, 2, 3, 4. So when I use these paper templates, one of the things I can do is I can push the paper template down to the clay, and because of the moisture of the clay, it'll kind of stick down there, right? It's going to be a little bit harder to get up, but that allows us to be a little bit more precise with how we are cutting everything. So I'm going to move this a little bit more towards the edge so that way I can have some extra clay left over at the end of this, all right? So I'm going to put it over here on an edge. I'm going to do that same thing, kind of press it down. And I'm going to do the same thing with all those other pieces, but I'm going to kind of cut these out one at a time, essentially. One thing I'm going to try not to do is really peel up these objects, and if I do peel them up, I want to make sure that I kind of smooth everything down and pack those particles back together so I get a lot less warping in the process. So we've got all of our pieces cut out, and the configuration that I had these was this direction, right? If I take this piece and actually use it to make a bowl, and this is the wall of my bowl like this would be kind of weird, right? Because this is gonna then make a convex surface, like looking up at you. totally doable. You can make it happen that way. But we've also got the option of taking it and spinning it around like this. So that way we have that rocker right there, and we can actually change the shape of the bowl down in the bottom to be that shape. And by doing that, that's going to kind of keep everything together, essentially, right? With all those walls. So essentially, this is going to be more like, I guess I should spin that around. It's going to be more like this, the way that they go on, right? And turn those around like so. And this is just my idea of doing this square shape bowl, right? You guys could come up with something a little bit different, okay? So when I go and I actually start scoring and slipping and putting these things together, this is gonna be like this. The curvature of that bowl is gonna come up, right? And I'm gonna be putting it on top of the bottom portion of the bowl, not on the sides of the bottom of the bowl. If I put it on the side of the bottom of the bowl, I'm not gonna end up having enough clay to do that. I wanna minimize things. I'm probably gonna have to cut some things as well. If I put this here and then another shape right next to it, it's not necessarily going to work out right, okay? I'm also going to be beveling some of these corners, so that way when these objects go together, they have a nice shape to them, okay? And they end up going together really nicely. So I want to keep track of which numbers are what, so I'm going to be leaving those paper templates on there for now. I also could lightly mark into the clay those numbers if I wanted to. Okay, or just keep them in the right configuration so you know what goes where. All right, so those are all options for this. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to let these things stiffen up a little bit, just a little bit. I'm not going to let them go until they get like leather hard. I'm just going to let them get maybe to about cheese hard or so. That way, a lot less of my finger indentations are going to end up going into the clay itself. So I'll just give it a little bit of time, and then we're going to be coming back to this. Another thing that I can do is, because this paper is going to continually get saturated from water, is what I can do is I can peel it up like so, and then just lightly lay it on top of there rather than it being pressed down very hard, okay? So it's assembly time, and I'm going to show you guys really quickly the way that I'm going to essentially assemble this thing. One thing that I mentioned to you before is that I'm going to be beveling the edges. So on these corners, where these corners go together, instead of it being a 90-degree angle like what we have here, I'm going to be cutting it so that way I have a 45-degree angle for those ends to touch each other. And there's a couple reasons why I like to do that. The number one reason why I like to do that is because it gives more surface area and it gives a cleaner connection when we put everything together. There is another way to join things, and the other way to join things is to take two pieces and essentially put them up next to each other like this, right? And what that's called is that's called a butt joint. So when we have a butt joint like that, we'd have to actually end up shortening two of these sides. But if we're not doing a butt joint, if we're connecting them with a bevel, then we don't have to cut anything down. We can keep it its original length, and everything should essentially fall into place and be the correct size. So I'm going to be putting the four walls together first, and then I'm going to be connecting it to our base. And when I connect it to that base is still soft. These pieces are still soft enough that when I go to put it together, I'll be able to actually curve that bottom portion to give it a little bit of a curve. So let's get to that assembly. So for this first wall, I'm going to go ahead and keep it real time, and then after that, for the rest of the assembly process, I'll go ahead and speed things up so that way we don't have to sit here and watch me play. I like to use an X-Acto blade. Reason I like an X-Acto blade is because it's nice and sharp. It's going to give me a good, clean cut, and it's very thin, so it's not really going to take material away or push material around all that much. It's a little bit harder when we're doing these bevel cuts to do it kind of freehand, but it's definitely something that can be done. I like to actually hold it so that way the piece is in front of me like so, and I can hold it at that 45-degree angle this direction. I can see where I'm cutting a little bit better. Sometimes I end up doing it this way. It's a little bit harder to see in that case, for me anyways. And you also could even hold it up in the air and kind of cut that 45-degree angle up in the air if you would like, right? We don't have to make it perfect. It can just be, we want to get it close to 45 degrees. It's clay, it can move around. So I'm gonna start here, And I'm making sure that the part that I'm taking away, that it's not going to end up changing that flat, straight portion that's down there. And now the clay is a bit harder at this point, and so because it's a little bit harder at this point, it doesn't stick quite as easily. And I also want to make sure that I keep these in the same configuration as they were before, so I know what number goes where, because I did freehand this template, and when I freehand a template like that, it's not necessarily going to be perfect in terms of each one of the walls being exactly the same size. And so that one I messed up a little bit on that one. You can see, when I hold that close, you can see how there's still a little bit of a flat edge, right, that's there. So I got to get a little bit more on there, a little bit deeper, essentially, into that cut. That should do it. There we go. All right, so I've got one piece done, and then I'm going to continue on for the rest. Just double checking on each one of these edges that it comes all the way in there. This one I got to take just a little bit more off. And that's the nice thing about using this X-Acto blade. You can be really precise with the amount of clay that you take off. Looking good. And there we have it. We've got all sides beveled. So if I take this and remove it over to the side so I can give myself a little bit more room, now I can go ahead and start assembling these, keeping it in that same configuration. And like I said, it's okay if that 45 is not perfect. We can kind of move it around, we can kind of push it around, but these things essentially are going to go together like so to create the walls of this object, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I've got some slip that I've set aside here that I'm going to be using. Just going to be scratching, slipping, scratching again, do that push and wiggle, and get these things together and try and keep it as square as possible. Right now, this object doesn't have perfectly aligned walls or anything like that. Some of these are a little bit taller. What I was doing is lining it up on the bottom. When you line it up on the bottom, that way this portion here, when we score and slip the other side to get that onto it, then that's gonna stick on there a little bit better, okay? So don't worry about this. We can actually come back and we're gonna change that edge anyway. I'm gonna do a little bit of pinching on this object. The pinching is gonna do a little bit of decorative I'm going to pinch it a little bit for decorative reasons, but also to thin it out a little bit, and also to make this edge look a little bit less machined or less tooled, like from using that X-Acto blade to cut it. I want to have a little bit nicer edge. So I'm going to be able to achieve that by doing a little bit of a pinch, and that's another reason why I want to have this object be still soft. I want to still be able to pinch it a little bit. There we have it. It's all been put together. There's some edges that are here that really need to be taken care of. But at this point in time, I don't really need to think about that. What I really want to think about is I'm going to do some cleanup on the inside. And that cleanup on the inside is just those edges in there. And if you have any big gaps that happen inside of there, what you actually want to do is you want to get a small little ribbon or a small little, not ribbon, a coil of clay, and put it inside of this section to kind of fill that in. So lots of different ways that you can come in here and clean this up. You can use a number of different tools. I like to use a small little brush or a silicone tip kind of smoother. You can also use the edge of a scraper or a rib, something that's got about a 90-degree angle on it, so that way you can kind of clean up those areas. And so it's going to take me a little bit of time to clean it up. We're going to go ahead and clean it up. One thing I want you to notice too with this is there's a bit of a curvature that's here on the bottom part of it, okay? That curvature is going to become a little bit more apparent as we move on in the building process. And then once this sits up a little bit more, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to this stuff. This is all the stuff that oozed out of my piece when I was making it, when I was pushing everything together and connecting it. I want to wait until that gets a little bit stiffer. It makes it a little bit easier to deal with, and it also makes it to where it's not so sticky, right? Not so sticky, not so liquidy. So that's one of the reasons why I want to wait to do anything to that. I wait a little bit on the inside as well, but the stuff that's on the inside corners, that stuff was taken care of a little bit earlier. So I think we should be at a good point where I could start kind of cleaning that stuff up. Basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start pinching these walls. Before I start pinching the walls, I may come back to some of these edges and kind of clean up these corner edges. It all depends on what you're looking for. If you want it to be a little bit more natural of a look and have a little bit more of a living edge, and look a lot less machined or production made, then maybe you want to leave it that way. I'm going to try and leave it that way and see what happens, right? So during this pinching process, one of the things I may be doing is pinching those areas, and as I'm pinching it, it's maybe going to change that up a little bit. And I'm even pinching down at the very bottom down here where this edge is, where that kind of ooze of slip kind of came out. All right, so got it all pinched out, got everything all good to go. Waited a little bit of time on the inside for that curvature. Wanted to give it a little bit of time to set up so that way when I was pushing on my foot that I didn't get rid of that curvature. And then I added a foot on there. This foot is added on just with a couple of pieces of the same slab, pinched out a little bit as well. So hold it a little bit closer, you guys can see it. That way, I went with a square, that way I could reinforce that square shape that we have for the whole object. And again, remember that doing this project, you do not have to make exactly what it is that I'm making. You can make anything, you can make any shapes that you want. You can make it a triangular bowl. You could make it into an octagon. The octagon's probably going to be a little bit more difficult. Your angles are going to be a little bit different depending on if if you're actually cutting things. But you could also make this thing circular, and that way you could actually bend around a slab of clay around that round portion, or you can even make it an oval, right? Do you have to have a foot? No, you do not. You can actually have the foot be the base of the object be the foot as well. So it's just all up to you as to how you want to finish that off. Just remember that any kind of you need to have some sort of a termination at the bottom. There should be some sort of a shadow line or some sort of an angle or something that basically is like defining that foot. We want to define our foot. We want to define our rim. Sometimes in defining the rim, it's essentially the absence of anything there. What I chose to do here is I chose to basically pinch it out, make it a little bit thinner on that rim area. and give it a little bit, make sure that I actually go through and smooth out that rim area, even though it's got a little bit of a waviness too, a little bit of undulation there, right? That's gonna work out, okay? Looks nice. And then that foot sits nicely on the table. It's nice and stable, and it's good to go. So enjoy making this slab bowl.